Let's talk about all the ways in which assumptions show up in our conversations, our relationships, and our fights. Since I've been making assumptions and paying the price for them for years now, I'll share my stories as examples of what not to do and offer some alternative approaches. You should be warned, though, I talk about some tough topics, and some of that might be triggering for you. Because to me, I don't think it's acceptable to not talk about this stuff. Oh, I'm also a little cussy. Please take care of yourself as you listen. Make yourself comfortable, grab a snack and a drink, and let's get started. Welcome to the first episode of my podcast, Confessions of a Chronic Assumer. I'm Ellen Patnaude. And before I tell you about myself, I thought it would be useful to establish a definition of assumptions, because once we do that, as I tell you about myself, I can show you the ways in which assumptions have been showing up throughout my life in terms of my own behavioral choices, the way that I interact with people, the way that I navigate situations, both so that hopefully you feel a little bit less alone if you find that some of the things I've done, you've also done. But also just to highlight how incredibly pervasive assumptions are in the way that we navigate all kinds of communication in every walk of life, in every situation. So let me just give you this definition. This is defined by the Oxford Learner's Dictionary. Assumptions are defined as a belief or a feeling that something is true or that something will happen, although there is no proof. And it's that last little piece that is the kicker every single time. There is no proof, and yet we persist in carrying these beliefs with us because we're making assumptions. So I first started thinking about this concept of assumptions in 2020. I'm a workplace communication coach. Before the COVID, my clients mostly wanted me to come in person on site. The only time that I would work with people via Zoom or some other remote technology is when I was coaching somebody one-on-one. Otherwise, most of the work that I was doing was in person. I would go on site to a company. I would be there for anywhere from half a day to a full week, just depending on the client and what they needed. When 2020 happened and the pandemic shut the world down, I was supposed to get on a plane. The day before everything shut down, I was supposed to get on a plane to go over to Belgium to work with an organization that I have supported for probably a dozen years. And I was going to spend 2 weeks there working with a variety of teams. We made the decision, because we had to, that I was not going to get on that plane and that we were going to postpone the trip. And we foolishly told ourselves at that time, we're just postponing it for, 3 or 4 weeks and then everything will be fine. That did not work out for any of us. And instead, the HR director that I was working with called me and said, I think we have a problem. These teams that are sort of new together that you were coming over to work with are now isolated from each other in their homes, trying to figure out how to work remotely. Nobody's talking to anybody else. And these problems we were seeing before COVID shut everything down, they're now amplified 10 times. I need you to step in. I need you to figure out how to work with these teams remotely. That started me on a path of reinventing the model that I was using, trying to figure it out. And I just had lots of one-on-one conversations with these team leads and with some members of the teams. And what I kept noticing is that I found myself saying or asking, wait, do you know that to be true, or are you making an assumption right now? And usually the answer to the question was, well, I don't know that to be true, but I'm pretty sure. Okay, well, that is literally the definition of an assumption. So I started thinking about it. The more I thought about it, the more I noticed it, sort of like that phenomenon when you first notice a new kind of car and you'd never noticed it on the road before, but all of a sudden, now that you're paying attention to it, now you see it everywhere. Same sort of thing happened in my brain with assumptions. The more I thought about them, the more I noticed them in my own communication, but also in the communication of people around me. Suddenly I realized I have a lot to say about this topic. Maybe I should do some writing about it. And as I wrote about it, I realized I have had a lifetime of experience of making assumptions. So I want to share some of that with you as I go through introducing myself to you. So first and foremost, above everything else, I am a human. I am a mother, I'm a wife, I'm a sister, I'm a daughter, I'm an aunt. Professionally, I'm a workplace communication coach, like I said. Where I got my start in life is very different than where I am now. I was born and raised in Detroit. And before you look at me and make assumptions, as I've had done so many times throughout my life, let me just clarify that when I say I'm from Detroit, I mean the city. I do not mean the suburbs. And that's important because I grew up in the 70s and 80s at a time when Detroit was radically racially shifting and changing. There was a lot happening there. So by the time I graduated from high school, I had been a racial minority in my schools and less so in my neighborhood. My neighborhood stayed relatively balanced and integrated, but certainly in school. And in my graduating class of 150-ish kids, from a Detroit public high school. I was one of, I don't even know, a handful of students who were not Black. Obviously, that had a huge impact on how I was shaped and how I see the world, especially coming right out of that situation and going to college. And when I went to college, I wanted to get away from home. I had a really difficult, combative relationship with my mother my whole life, which I will talk about plenty as we navigate this podcast together. But at that time, it was acute, and I really needed to get away. So even though I'd been accepted to schools that I could have stayed at home and driven to, like U of M or Wayne State, I thought, I need to get the hell out of here. So I chose Alma College. And Alma College is in the dead center of the state of Michigan, the mitten part, the lower part. And what that meant is that I was going to a school that not only had very few non-white students, but most of the students there had never had any sort of real experience with people who weren't like them. So they'd all come from small towns. They'd come from other places, mostly Michigan, a handful of people from outside of Michigan. And they did not know how to talk to me. When I first showed up, I got asked this question, oh yeah, where are you from? Like, you're new on the dorm. We're meeting everybody. We're freshmen, right? And I get the question of like, where are you from? And I say, oh, I'm from Detroit. And they're like, oh my God, me too. Where? And I'd say, Northwest Side, Rosedale Park neighborhood. And they'd be like, oh, no. Like what town? Detroit. I'm from Detroit. Oh no, honey, white people don't live in Detroit. Like West Bloomfield maybe, or Southfield. Like, where are you actually from? I'd be like, I'm from Detroit, motherfucker. It was infuriating and it was confusing because I assumed that I was not the only person that had had this experience. This was my normal. Right? So a lot of times assumptions are informed by what our normal is. And for me, my normal was growing up in this very diverse, inclusive, racially diverse on lots of levels. There were lots of gay couples around us in our neighborhood. There were Black people and brown people and like just people from everywhere. And that was my normal. Arriving on the Alma College campus, I had literally never seen so many white people in one place before. And it was disorienting for me. And I made a lot of assumptions about them coming in that they were going to have the same sort of lens through which they looked at life that I did. And that turned out to be horribly wrong. And they assumed that was because I was from Detroit. Once I really firmly clarified that, they thought, oh, so you must have been in a gang. So they would ask me questions like, were you in a gang? No, I was not in a gang. Oh, you must have gone to private school because they'd heard that the Detroit public schools were crap. Nope, I did not go to a private school. I went to a Detroit public high school, Renaissance High School, in fact, which is a magnet school, but it is not a private school. It just means you got to have good grades to get in. As my brother used to, I assume, lovingly say when we were growing up, it's where the nerdy smart kids go. I'm not sure he meant it in a kind way, but I'm going to go with that assumption, assume positive intent. Anyway, as I was meeting students who were telling me they were from actually suburbs of Detroit and I was from Detroit, their assumptions projected onto me, my assumptions projected onto them, and it made for an interesting start to our relationships. I walked around with a chip on my shoulder for a lot of college. I felt like I had something to prove. I met some of the Black students who were from little towns in Ohio, for example. They didn't know what to do with me any more than the white suburban students I met knew what to do with me. So I had a lot of confusion about why people were responding to me in a certain way, and also just confusion about how to approach them more effectively to make those relationships work. When I left college, I tried to get a job working in a lab. I had a biology degree. And as I was interviewing for the position, I assumed I was supposed to be super honest about my plans for the future, which included going abroad to live in Central America for a year. And it turned out that caused me to be passed over for different job opportunities. When I actually got down to Central America, I was in rural Nicaragua for a year. I was working for a Protestant denomination that shall remain nameless because we did not part on good terms. But I was there representing a partnership that existed in this rural town with organizations doing community development work, you could call it, and the denomination here in Michigan. And there were there were more assumptions than I could possibly count about. Even though I had come from a pretty culturally diverse background, I had not handled it on that level of diversity. So there were a lot of assumptions that I made about cultural things. I'm not proud of this, but the cultural norms, if you will, of where I had come from in comparison to the place that I was landing. There were assumptions about the speed at which I would pick up the language because I did not speak Spanish going in. So the learning curve was incredibly high. There was also an assumption that as a barely 24-year-old graduate from a Midwestern liberal arts college with a Bachelor of Arts in biology, I was somehow qualified to run a reforestation project in rural Central America with a completely different ecosystem. So there were all sorts of assumptions that were involved in that year. I think the biggest one was that I did not have the ability to make a difference. My early life had not prepared me with an internal monologue setting me up for success and boosting my confidence. The opposite was true. So it wasn't even on my radar that it was possible for me to make a difference in the lives of people that I was meeting and working with while I was there. And yet, after the first year, at the end of the first year, when I got kicked out, story for another day, the people I'd been working with in these 12 different little tiny communities came into the central town for a meeting. And one by one, they stood up and talked about what a difference what we had been doing together made in their lives and the difference that I had made in their lives. And I was sitting there thinking, the opposite is what's true. You have made a huge difference in my life and helped me understand I don't belong doing work in science because science was not what kept me there through the near kidnapping and the disease that almost killed me on walking down a road and all the harassment, sexual harassment that I dealt with in the year that I lived there. Science had nothing to do with what kept me rooted in that spot. It was the people in these little communities that I was working with. They made a difference in my life. When I left that work, I came back to the US trying to figure out what to call what I had been doing. in order to try to find my way into that work. And I stumbled into community organizing. That work was full of assumptions about me. I was 25, young, apparently some thought good looking. And so there was an assumption, what would a nice little white girl like you be doing in Gary, Indiana, in a rough part of town, trying to do this kind of work for social justice and metropolitan equity? Because they didn't know my backstory. They didn't know where I'd come from. They made assumptions about me based on what I looked like. And also that I had slept my way into the job. There was an assumption that I was involved with the executive director, who was 10 years older than me and a man. And that must be how I got the job, or why I came there to do the job. Again, they didn't know anything about me. They were making assumptions. And we do that every time we meet a new person. I left that work when I started having kids. I wanted to move closer to family and have some support. So I moved back to Michigan, intending to spend a year writing the story of what I'd been through in Nicaragua, because I realized it had had a really lasting impact on me. And I just wanted to be closer to family and take a little bit of a break. So I did. And I wrote that book, but I didn't realize my phone would start ringing and I would end up accidentally starting a business that, as of this month, May 2024, is now 19 years old. That was the beginning of my business. I assumed baby number 2 would fix my marriage that was struggling. And instead, baby number 2 helped me realize I needed to come out already and leave that marriage because it was not good for anyone. I assumed that coming out would cause rejection from my family and my friends. I was absolutely terrified. Even though I had grown up in a pretty supportive environment with lots of gay men around, I had not met very many lesbians. And I was terrified about what my family and my friends were going to think and how they were going to support me or not. So there was a boatload of assumptions that came up in navigating those personal and very private relationships. Mostly that was not true. They were mostly very supportive and embracing. I unfortunately will say that was not true of a subset of my father's family, who actually thought I should have my children taken away from me because being gay meant I was unfit to raise my children. My children are now about to turn 18 and 20, and they're very successful humans, so they were wrong. Working as a workplace communication coach, I meet people from all over the place, from all different kinds of backgrounds. My business has gone through many evolutions in the 19 years that it has existed. And I had some assumptions that made me inconsistent, that made me less credible somehow, because I was changing my mind or I was waffling, because there are so many messages that society and culture give us, particularly as women, that changing your mind, there's all kinds of jokes about it, right? That changing our minds means that we are inconsistent or wishy-washy, when really what it means is that I'm flexible and I'm adaptable. So that's a narrative around assumptions that I would love for us to collectively disrupt. I did write that first book. It is my first book. It's not available at the moment because I've taken it offline, realizing that it needs some rework. And I'm hopeful that next year in 2025, I will be able to re-release it. But as I wrote that book, which is all about that year in Nicaragua and the ways in which it shaped me, I assumed I was not worthy of telling my own story. What would people want to hear from me about? I had folks encouraging me to reach out to traditional publishers to try to get it published, and I laughed at them literally because I thought, who's going to care about my story? Who am I? And so I allowed a small handful of people eventually that gave feedback about that story and the way that it was written to make me feel enough pressure and shame that I took it down. I took it off the listing on Amazon. I took it out of publication so that nobody could get their hands on it, because assumptions about my own value and worthiness and ability to tell a story that was honest and real somehow shouldn't be out there. So I let them bully me into taking it down. But I'm reworking it, like I said, and I hope to re-release it next year. The second book that I wrote is the one that came out of all this experience in 2020, and that is the book about assumptions. It's called I Thought You Knew, Confessions of a Chronic Assumer. And there, if you're looking for more guidance than what you might get in this podcast, I offer that as a place where you can get some guidance about this stuff in book form. Some of us learn better when we read. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on my website if you want a signed copy. And then book number three is freshly out as of Mother's Day. This is the big work. It's called You're Not Doing It Right. The subtitle is Loving My Mother Through an Unpredictable Caregiving Journey. It is a memoir about this absolutely hellacious caregiving journey that we went on with my mom as she suffered from a very aggressive form of dementia called Lewy body dementia. I learned a whole new level of what it means to make assumptions and to have assumptions made through the dimension of caregiving. And I'm going to talk a lot about that, but not some of the typical assumptions that you might think, that you might assume. I made assumptions about the level of advocacy I would have to do for my mom. I made assumptions about how she would handle the diagnosis and accept it, which she never did through to the end. I also was subjected to lots of assumptions about being a caregiver and about what our capacity is as caregivers. There's like this halo that they hand out when you start caregiving. Obviously untrue, but that's what it felt like. This halo where I'm supposed to be some sort of a martyr, where I'm supposed to have this endless amount of patience and be this like really nice person that just isn't fucking me. And so it was a mostly frustrating and very isolating experience to be a caregiver. And I believed my mother every time she said I wasn't doing it right, which was her go-to mantra. I believed her. And I wasn't able to just follow the advice that I was reading in all the books that were out there about just be more patient, just redirect, don't lose your temper. Oh my God, what a load of crap. We all know we're supposed to be better humans than we feel capable of being, and yet we're still human. So I really want to try to overcome some of the assumptions that are made in the realm of caregiving as well. So, the overarching messages that I have consistently received since childhood are that we're not supposed to talk about a whole host of things. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next episode, because I'm going to call bullshit on that right now. I'm not interested in continuing the shame narrative. There should be no shame. It is rooted in assumption about what we think we're capable of, what we deserve, what we're allowed to think, and what we're allowed to say. And I don't think there should be rules about that stuff. I think that we ought to be able to have open and honest conversations with each other. And I'm here to try and encourage you to do it with me, because if I'm the only one doing it, it's a lonely road. But if more of us are out there trying to overturn that narrative, we may begin to see a shift in how these things work. So here's an overview of the things we're going to talk about in this podcast. We're going to talk about real shit. We're going to talk about uncomfortable shit. And we're going to talk about funny shit. All of it centered around assumptions and the way that they interfere with successful and effective communication in every facet of your life, from your private, personal relationships at home, with friends, with family, with a spouse, with a partner, with kids, to the conversations you have to navigate at work, to the conversations that you just navigate with yourself in terms of your own self-talk, because assumptions show up in all of those places. So if you want to find me on socials, obviously you've located me for the podcast, either on a podcast channel that you like or on YouTube. But to find me on LinkedIn, you can find me at Ellen Patnaude on LinkedIn. You can find me on Facebook and Instagram at Patnaude Coaching. And I just want to say thank you for joining me today. Thanks for being a part of this journey. Come back next week. We're going to be talking about all the assumptions surrounding what we are supposed to say, think, feel, and how we can debunk that. Have a great week.